They told Captain Ilara Finch that her methods were unorthodox and potentially dangerous, that training soldiers required decades of institutional knowledge, not improvised techniques learned from civilian sources. The commanding officer at the infantry battle school said she was undermining established doctrine, and the senior instructors demanded to know where she had learned tactics that did not appear in any manual. But when her platoon scored the highest marks in combat readiness evaluations in 20 years and completed a hostage extraction in half the expected time, the question stopped being about her credentials and started being about why the Army had been teaching it wrong for so long. Ilara Finch was 31 when she became the youngest female infantry captain in the British Army. She had dark hair cut short, a compact build that made her faster than most soldiers twice her size, and a teaching style that made instructors uncomfortable because it worked better than theirs. She did not look like someone who would revolutionize close-quarters combat training, but results rarely cared about appearances. She grew up in South London, where her mother worked as a physiotherapist, and her father ran a martial arts gym in Brixton. The gym was not the typical karate for kids operation. It was a serious training facility where mixed martial artists, boxers, and security professionals came to learn practical combat skills. Ilara spent her childhood in that gym, watching her father teach techniques that actually worked in real confrontations rather than controlled competitions. Her father, Marcus, was former Royal Marines who had left the service after an injury ended his career. He was frustrated by military combat training that focused on forms and procedures rather than effectiveness. He studied everything: Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Krav Maga, boxing, wrestling, and synthesized it into a system that prioritized efficiency over tradition. By the time Ilara was 16, she could handle herself better than most trained soldiers. She joined the army at 23, not because of family pressure, but because she wanted to serve. She passed officer training and was commissioned into the infantry, assigned to training roles at the infantry battle school in Brecon. The work was important, preparing soldiers for deployment, but the methods felt outdated to someone who had grown up learning combat that actually worked. If these stories speak to you, please subscribe. We share the experiences of veterans who challenge the system and prove that innovation matters as much as tradition. Ilara's father had a saying that defined his approach to teaching: "If it does not work when you are exhausted, scared, and hurt, then it does not work." He built his training system around that principle. No complicated techniques that required perfect conditions. No moves that only functioned against compliant partners. Just simple, brutal efficiency that worked when everything else failed. Marcus taught Ilara that most combat training was backwards. It taught soldiers complex skills under ideal conditions and hoped they could apply them under stress. Real training should do the opposite. Teach simple skills under terrible conditions so they became instinctive when it mattered. Ilara absorbed this philosophy. She trained at her father's gym through university, working as an assistant instructor. She saw security professionals, police officers, and military personnel from various countries come through. They all said the same thing. The training they received in their official roles was inadequate for real violence. When Ilara joined the army, she expected military combat training to be sophisticated and effective. Instead, she found it was rigid and often impractical. Soldiers learned techniques in controlled environments that bore little resemblance to actual combat. They practiced movements until they were perfect, but never under the exhaustion and stress that defined real fights. Ilara understood why. Military training required standardization. You needed methods that could be taught to thousands of soldiers with varying abilities. But standardization had calcified into tradition, and tradition resisted change even when better methods existed. She decided she would teach soldiers the way her father had taught her, not by following the manual, but by understanding what actually worked. The conflict started during Ilara's second year at the infantry battle school. She was assigned to train a platoon of newly qualified infantry soldiers in close-quarters battle techniques. The standard curriculum was well established. Room-clearing procedures, weapon transitions, team movement. It was thorough, procedural, and in Ilara's assessment, too slow. She started incorporating techniques from her father's system. Instead of teaching soldiers to move through buildings in rigid formations, she taught them to flow like water, adapting to threats as they appeared. Instead of memorizing specific procedures for every scenario, she taught them principles that applied to any situation. Identify the threat, control the space, neutralize efficiently. The soldiers responded immediately. They moved faster, made better decisions under pressure, and showed confidence that typically took months to develop. Their performance in training exercises was exceptional. Then the complaints started. Lieutenant Colonel Graham Ashford, the senior officer overseeing training programs, received reports that Captain Finch was not following approved curriculum. Other instructors said her methods deviated from doctrine. Some suggested she was teaching unsafe techniques that would get soldiers killed in actual combat. Ashford called Ilara to his office. He was a career officer with 28 years of service, a man who believed the Army's training methods had been refined through decades of experience. He asked Ilara to explain why she thought she knew better than institutional knowledge. Ilara tried to explain. She talked about efficiency, about simplifying techniques so they worked under stress, about training soldiers to think rather than just follow procedures. Ashford listened, then told her to return to the approved curriculum. The Army had standards for a reason. Ilara complied outwardly, but she continued teaching her methods during informal sessions, early mornings before official training, evenings after the scheduled curriculum was complete. The soldiers came voluntarily because they saw the difference in their own performance. Ilara knew she was risking her career. Disobeying a direct order from a superior officer was grounds for serious consequences, but she could not watch soldiers receive inadequate training when she knew how to prepare them properly. She called her father one evening and told him about the situation. Marcus listened quietly, then asked her a simple question. If soldiers deployed with only the official training and died because they were not prepared, could she live with that? Ilara knew the answer. She could not, but the weight of it sat heavily. She was not trying to undermine the Army. She respected the institution and understood why procedures existed. She just believed that training methods needed to evolve, that techniques developed for conflicts decades ago might not be optimal for current threats. The moral conflict kept her awake some nights. Was she arrogant for thinking she knew better? Was she helping soldiers or just feeding her own ego? She watched her students carefully, looking for any sign that her methods were failing them. She saw the opposite. They moved with confidence. They made good decisions under pressure. They adapted to changing situations instead of freezing when things did not match their training scenarios. That gave her the answer she needed. This was not about ego. It was about effectiveness. And if the system punished her for that, so be it. The tension escalated when Ilara's platoon participated in a major training exercise at the Stanford training area. Multiple platoons would conduct simulated operations against an opposing force, with observers grading performance. It was high-visibility training that senior officers used to assess unit readiness. The scenario was complex, a hostage situation in a compound with multiple buildings, armed hostiles and civilian actors playing captives. Each platoon would attempt the rescue, and their time, casualties, and civilian safety would be scored. Most platoons took between 45 minutes to an hour to complete the scenario, with moderate casualties and mixed results on civilian safety. The exercise was designed to be difficult, to push soldiers beyond their comfort zone. Ilara's platoon completed it in 18 minutes, with 0 friendly casualties and all hostages secured safely. The observers initially thought there was a mistake. They reviewed the footage, interviewed the soldiers, and verified the results. Everything was legitimate. Ilara's platoon had moved through the compound with a speed and efficiency that seemed impossible given their experience level. Ashford demanded an explanation. He watched the video recordings and saw immediately that Ilara's soldiers were not using standard tactics. They moved fluidly, adapted instantly to threats, and made decisions without waiting for orders. It was effective but completely outside approved doctrine. He convened a formal review. Ilara was ordered to present her training methods to a panel of senior officers and instructors. They wanted to understand what she was teaching and whether it was safe, effective, or even appropriate for military use. The review took place in a conference room at the Infantry Battle School. Ashford sat at the center of a long table, flanked by 4 other senior officers and 3 master instructors with decades of experience. Elara stood at the front, facing them. Ashford opened by asking the central question, "Who trained you? Where did these methods come from? What made her think she could improve on established military doctrine?" Elara could have deflected. She could have claimed her techniques were just minor adaptations of existing methods. Instead, she told them the truth. She said her father, a former Royal Marine, had developed a combat system based on effectiveness rather than tradition. She said she had trained in that system since childhood and had seen it work for security professionals, police and military personnel from multiple countries. She said the methods prioritized simplicity, adaptability and efficiency, which made them ideal for soldiers operating under extreme stress. One of the master instructors, a sergeant major with 30 years of experience, interrupted. He said the army had refined its combat training through decades of real-world operations. He asked what made her father's civilian gym more qualified than institutional military knowledge. Elara did not argue. She just pointed at the exercise results displayed on the screen behind her. 18 minutes. 0 casualties. All hostages secured. She asked them to show her any other newly qualified platoon that had achieved similar results. The room went quiet. Ashford asked about safety. Were her methods riskier? Did they expose soldiers to unnecessary danger? Elara pulled up injury statistics from her training sessions compared to standard training. Her numbers were lower. She explained that simpler techniques meant fewer opportunities for mistakes, and training under realistic stress conditions meant soldiers were better prepared for actual chaos. Another officer asked about standardization. How could the army adopt methods that came from outside official channels? Elara's response was direct. She said the army should care about what works, not where it comes from. She said institutional knowledge was valuable, but should not be sacred. She said soldiers deserved the best training available, regardless of whether it appeared in current manuals. Then she made an offer. Let her train another platoon using only official methods. Run the same exercise. Compare the results objectively. If standard training performed better, she would never deviate from doctrine again. Ashford looked at the other officers. There was a long pause. Then he accepted her proposal. The comparison took 3 weeks. Elara trained one platoon using only her methods. Another instructor trained a matched platoon using standard curriculum. Both groups had similar experience levels and physical capabilities. At the end of 3 weeks, both attempted the same hostage rescue scenario. The standard trained platoon completed it in 42 minutes with 3 simulated casualties. Elara's platoon completed it in 20 minutes with 0 casualties. The results were presented to senior leadership at the infantry battle school. The data was clear. Elara's methods produced measurably better outcomes in shorter time frames with fewer training injuries. Ashford was a career officer, but he was not stupid. He recognized effectiveness when the evidence was overwhelming. He authorized Elara to formalize her training methods and pilot them with additional units. He brought in external reviewers to assess safety and effectiveness. Every review came back positive. Within a year, elements of Elara's approach were being incorporated into official training curriculum. Not a wholesale replacement, the Army moved slowly but a meaningful evolution. Instructors were taught to emphasize adaptability over rigid procedures. Training scenarios incorporated more stress and chaos. Techniques were simplified to work under worst-case conditions. Elara was promoted to Major and assigned to develop updated combat training doctrine. She worked with her father and other experts to create a system that balanced institutional knowledge with practical effectiveness. The manual she co-authored became required reading at the infantry battle school. Some senior officers never forgave her for challenging established methods. Others quietly thanked her for having the courage to push for change. Elara did not care much about either response. She cared that soldiers were being prepared properly. She eventually left the army after 10 years of service. She returned to London and took over her father's gym when he retired. The facility expanded, training military personnel, law enforcement, and security professionals from around the world. On the wall of her office hangs a framed photograph from the Stanford training area. It shows her platoon after completing the hostage rescue in 18 minutes. They are young, confident, and ready. Below the photo is a quote her father told her years ago. "Tradition deserves respect, but soldiers deserve what works." Ilara built her career on that principle, and the soldiers she trained carried it with them into combat, where it saved lives that procedures alone might not have protected.